Sometimes it's bigger than us. Sometimes it's truly out of control. It's truly nothing that we can do to stop it. So it's refocusing your brain a little bit to say, what can I do and where can I make the most good?
From Los Angeles, this is Code 3, the Firefighters podcast, hosted by award-winning journalist Scott Orr. Now, here's Scott.
That's right, and I will not let Parkinson stop me. Thank you for joining me today on another edition of Code 3. This is the show that gives you all the information on a firefighting topic you need in about 20 minutes. Now let's get started. It's getting hotter outside, and that traditionally signals the start of the wildland fire season in the U.S. Nowadays, of course, there's no real season when wildland fires burn. The season can be all year long in some parts of the country. We won't argue about the reasons why. Suffice it to say, wildland fires are growing bigger and more frequent than in the past. And as residents of the Northeast U.S. can attest, they are starting to burn in less fire-prone regions. With that in mind, and considering that this month is the 10th anniversary of the loss of the Granite Mountain Hotshots in Arizona, we're talking wildland fires. This time it's a sort of primer on decision-making for those fighting fires in the backcountry, and some lessons learned from a guest who's familiar to those who've listened to Code 3 for a while. Chad Costa is Assistant Fire Chief for the city of Petaluma, California. He's had 24 years of experience working in both urban and wildland firefighting environments. That includes time at CAL FIRE and as an Operations Branch Director for California Interagency Team 1. And Chad Costa joins me now. Welcome back to Code 3.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm glad to be here.
You have had a good deal of wildland firefighting experience as well as structure fire experience. And since this is the time when wildland fire season really cranks up, this seems like a good time to discuss some lessons learned in the backcountry. Out west we have dual-purpose firefighters who fight structural fires and also do wildland work. What would you say is the major risk difference?
It is California, right? And California is well known for wildfires. Unfortunately, many times fires in California because we love to live in the country and in the trees, and we like to move out of the cities and kind of get away from the traffic and the population. Unfortunately, that is put us, at risk to wildfire. So with California, we've had some drought seasons, but whether there's a drought or not, we deal with the intermix or the interface, which is basically houses that are built in the forest or around brush or just kind of out of the cities. And that, I think that in combination with just the weather here on the West Coast, specifically in California, typically dry, long periods of summer. And then you include the topography of the mountains, some very big mountains, the Sierras. And lastly, probably the most important factor with, explosive wildfire growth is wind. We deal with a lot of wind in Northern California as well as Southern California with the Santa Anas. And in my career, in my 24 to 25 years, I remember, working for CAL FIRE, spending a lot of time in the summertime down south, down in Southern California. And what I've seen in the last 10 years is kind of a transition to where we've been spending more time in the north. Unfortunately, a lot more forests, it's really difficult to get around the fire or stop the growth. Seen a lot of communities burn down. It's been a rough few years for us. So here in Northern California, and then specifically in the county that I work in, Sonoma County, 2017, 18, 2020, some significant disastrous wildfires that rank, in the top 10 for size and destruction. So I don't know significant differences other than fuel, wind, and topography, and combine that with drought. And this is where we're at.
Now, you mentioned that in the last few years, the circumstances have changed. Would you say that's the new normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a question that all of us ask ourselves.
Do you go into each year thinking maybe this year it's going to be a little different, it's going to be a little less hazardous?
Yeah, this is a good question. Something I thought lost a lot of sleep about over the last few years. And in 2017, when we had the destructive wildfire, the LNU complex, the Tubbs, Nuns, there's quite a few that October. We all thought, this was just kind of a one-time thing, or we weren't really sure if it was going to be the new normal. And then 2018, it happened again. I think 2020, it happened again. So a lot of us were kind of convinced that this is the new normal. I hope it's not. We did have a reprieve last season where it was, I would say, a fairly light fire season there. But the big difference is that last year, I can't remember any significant red flag events. Red flag meaning, heat and wind and low humidity all at the same time. We didn't have those critical fire weather events last year, so we didn't see the destruction in California. But I think that what's personally for me, what's engraved in my brain of what we saw, the last 10 years, I do go into the wildfire season less hopeful, if you will. I do expect there to be, destructive wildfires. We just kind of keep our fingers crossed and hope that the stars don't align to where we get into those critical fire weather periods where, essentially, no matter what you throw at it, you only can do so much good.
Yeah, the season has grown to be all year from some points of view, depending on where you live.
Yeah, I mean, we had a really strong winter this winter. Our lakes are full. There's a lot of smiles on people's faces. We faced many years of drought, but that doesn't allow us to really keep our guard down. It might slow fire season or delay fire season. The upper elevations that still have snow, but the lower elevations now have significant grass crop, and it really just comes down to I believe it just comes down to wind. Are we going to have a really windy summer, or are we going to get that reprieve again where we only have a few or very little red flag events? I mean, fires happen outside of red flag events, but when they do happen in those critical fire weather, events, sometimes they last multiple days. That just skyrockets our risk. So it's always just kind of pay really close attention and be ahead of things. And the weather people are amazing at giving us, kind of triggers and heads up that something's coming so we can try to prepare as much as possible.
Yeah. In Arizona, they've routinely said that if you have a wet winter, that's great, but it just means more fuel when everything dries out.
Sure.
So in structure firefighting, you have a lot of acronyms. In wildland firefighting, the acronyms aren't so big, but things like the 18 watchouts and the 10 firefighting orders. And so that makes me wonder, is wildland firefighting more or less technically oriented than structure firefighting?
Me personally, I have a strong passion for the wildfire environment. I spent some years with CAL FIRE that kind of sparked my interest in that environment. I don't want to get too much into an argument about one being more technical than the other. I think both of them are super technical, depending on the building, the fire environment, people that are potentially trapped or are needing rescue. And there's a lot of things in the structure environment that can make a fire very technical. And even sometimes, you look at injuries and deaths and line of duty deaths, sometimes they just happen in a straightforward single family residence, just because the fuel that's inside the buildings now and flash over and just the rapid growth of fires that we're seeing in buildings with the fuels that we're putting in them. But as far as structural firefighting goes, I think it's extremely technical. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a structure and how you attack a fire, and it depends on the type of structure, the size, where people are, the building age, what is burning, how much is burning, all those things we have to take into account when we do our risk assessment and we decide what kind of tactics and strategies we're gonna use. In wildland firefighting, it's no different. It's just sometimes a massive scale. So I've been a part of the leadership of some fires, over 1 million acres. When you talk about a wildfire, you do that same size, that same risk assessment. What are our values at risk? Is it truly out in the forest where there's no houses, and people would think, oh, well, there's no houses, there's no people, can't be that technical. What is your risk? Well, you got to keep in mind that, our trees, our forests, our ecosystems, our forest lands that are being forested for the buildings that we live in, all of that are values, and some are significant value. Archaeological sites. I mean, there's so much out there in our world that we need to protect and that do have value. So when you talk about wildland fire, where it can get extremely technical is now you have a large, rapid growing wildfire that is threatening, communities, homes, and people's lives. And that becomes where I think is where that kind of nexus is to the technicality of our decision making, and that risk assessment really skyrockets when you start having these fast moving wildfires that are burning through or burning down or threatening communities and people's lives. And in California specifically, I mean, I've gone to other states as well and dealt with similar issues, but it feels like here the wildfires are much more technical because there's just so many more houses and there's so much more threat or risk, as well as, value that are in front of these things, and trying to figure out what you're going to try to save, many times it's just save as many lives and ourselves as much as we can. Save as many buildings as we can. And then they talk about buildings. You can get pretty technical with what buildings are you going to throw your resources at? What are you going to try to save? Those valued buildings that are key to the life of the community after the fire, schools and banks, and just trying to make those decisions about where you're going to put a couple resources. I mean, when you talk about a 1 million acre fire, or you talk about a multiple mile long fire front, and you have firefighters. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but there's surely no way that we have enough, to protect everything. So it does become super technical, and it can be, in my mind, more technical than the vast majority of structural fires, just depending on the size and the complexity.
All right. So now, what is your most important experience that led to a lesson learned in the wildland arena?
Just two pop into mind. They're two completely different fires in complexity. Like I mentioned earlier, Sonoma County and the area I live in has unfortunately been devastated by wildfire over the last, 5, I guess we're staring at maybe 7 years now. And I'll tell you that one of the biggest lessons for me and just the changes is you're raised in the fire service to be aggressive. You're raised in the fire service to get after it, and to save whatever that is, lives or buildings or the environment. I mean, that's the culture that we're raised in. That's a culture that we stand by.
Right.
We're there to save. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that, these fires and some of these things that we're faced with, there's truly a helpless feeling. And there's moments and there's days where you feel like you just can't do anything. Either you can't do anything right, or everything you try isn't working. It can be extremely frustrating for most firefighters, if not all, until you learn that lesson of, sometimes it's bigger than us. Sometimes it's truly out of control. It's truly nothing that we can do, to stop it. So it's refocusing your brain a little bit to say, okay, what can I do and where can I make the most good? And sometimes the most good is just getting the hell out of the way. Sometimes it's just saving yourself and your firefighters and that engine's lives. Sometimes it's just getting as many people as you can out of the way, either by an early warning, alert warning, or just by throwing them in the back of your fire engine or your pickup. I mean, there's numerous stories of firefighters saving people's lives, in the last minute. So I think that's a big one for me, is just accepting the fact that sometimes you're not going to win, and refocusing your mindset to where can you win. Sometimes little wins add up to big ones. That's been a big change for me. Quite frankly, most fires that I've been to, there's successes, large successes. They go out, you drive away, and you feel proud about what you did. And there's been quite a few days in the last few years where I just put my head down and just it almost brings tears to your eyes, and has, just because you just kind of feel hopeless. And like I said, it's just bigger than you. The other lesson learned is really how important, we talked about acronyms, in CAL FIRE, in the wildfire environment, they use SFACs, the structured triage decision-making process, where it talks about survival, the fire environment, access, time constraints, and ultimately is trying to give us out on the line some benchmarks to say, and some evaluation marks to say, hey, we can stay here and fight, or we need to get the heck out of the way and leave, because we may not survive if we stay where we're at. We've had some fires. I've had some experiences. Specifically, I'll talk about one in Washington. In Washington, with the federal incident management team, we were tasked with what I would say is a fairly small fire. It really wasn't large when we got there, at least in my mind, compared to what we've seen in California. Didn't seem to be super technical, but one of the things that was extremely important, and I learned the hard way, was this area of the region had every 4 or 5 days would have a pretty significant wind event, and it had to do with geographical features that caused it to happen. And not living in the area, it was kind of like, oh yeah, it can't be that bad. We deal with wind. Unfortunately, one afternoon, this wind event occurred, and there were some people under my command that were trapped by fire. And thank God, they ended up surviving with no injuries. They essentially were able to get into it wasn't, I don't know, you could call it a safety zone. You could call it
was it a burned over area, like a black area?
Yeah, no, they didn't get burned over. I mean, I'm not really sure if we want to call it a safety zone or not, or a TRA. Those are kind of two terms used in the wildfire environment. It's probably more of a TRA than a safety zone, but a temporary refuge area. Anyways, no matter how good you plan, no matter how much you think about safety and escape routes and safety zones and TRAs, sometimes you just get caught. And that day we did. Luckily, everybody survived. But as gut wrenching as that afternoon was, quite frankly, I've lost a lot of sleep over that day. It just really reinforced that, sometimes we just lose. Sometimes, no matter how much we try, no matter how much we plan, we end up in these scary kind of bad situations. And so as a leader in wildfire, as a branch director, as somebody that's out there, responsible for sometimes a lot of people, I take the safety side of this job, or I take the importance of what we're taught about, escape routes and really evaluating risk much more seriously than I ever did. I'll still consider myself an aggressive firefighter, but it's way more cautious than I ever was. And really, that's just from learning the hard way, unfortunately, learning that, being too aggressive or too confident will bite you in this wildfire environment.
It sounds like it's something similar to being an aircraft pilot, where you have to play that mental game in your head. What if I lose an engine here? Where am I going to land? What if the wind direction changes? Is the flame going to come up over that ridge?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think where the complexities of wildfire leadership come in too is, in a structure fire, of course, a high rise or something, you may have a lot more people, but I think that's more realistic to what we're dealing with, is kind of that high rise situation where you have multiple floors, you have many firefighters, it's spread out geographically in a building, you have a rapidly growing fire. And as a leader on the fire ground, unfortunately, like for one, the August complex, I think the branch that I had was like 25 air miles. And so it took me about 2 days to drive the whole branch, the area that I was responsible for. So how can I really be everywhere at once? You can't. And you have to put a lot of trust in people. You have to give a clear direction and clear leaders' intent of what the task is at hand. And you have to really rely on your mid-management, your lower management supervisors to listen and to be paying attention and take that, that direction that they're given, which is very difficult for most, chief officers or most leaders in wildfire environment, supervisors, just not having that control and having to really rely on people to make good decisions. And it really falls back on us to give good leaders' intent. Hey, what is the objectives? What are we trying to save? What are the values at risk out there, so that they can make, good decisions that hopefully save their lives and others' lives as well. It's a challenge, and I've spent many hours sitting in a pickup or on a ridge somewhere, just stressed out as can be, just hoping that everything falls together and the pieces come together. And, sometimes they don't.
That sounds like a good place to leave it for today. Chad Costa, thanks for talking with me today on Code 3.
Right on, Scott. Thanks for having me again.
And there's more on what you need to know about wildland firefighting at our website, code3podcast.com/backcountry. Now, if you're still here, that means you like the show enough to listen all the way through. Thanks. Please, if I could ask you a favor, go tell another firefighter about Code 3. Do it in person or online, it doesn't matter how. Just spread the word. That's the important part. Alright, that's it. That's all for this edition of Code 3. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next time with more, and I hope you'll join me. I'm Scott Orr, and until then, stay safe.
To contact us, get more information on today's show, or to subscribe to the podcast, go to code3podcast.com.